The worker drove the stake into my road 3 times, clean and deliberate, like hammering a nail into a coffin that wasn't finished yet. My name is Silas Miller. I'm 68 years old. My wife Dorothy's insulin runs $12,000 this year. I've been skipping my own blood pressure pills to cover her costs. That was my road. The road my father built by hand in 1952. 4 generations of Millers have driven on it. Then Harrison Thorne, the construction CEO who wanted my land for his highway project, slid a check across the podium at the town hall like he was feeding a stray dog. $50,000, Mr. Miller. Be reasonable. This road, I said quieter than I expected my own voice to come out, has had a Miller on it for 70 years. Thorne smiled. And yet on paper, it isn't yours. 200 of my neighbors were watching. Some of them were already laughing. I could hear the word relic moving through the crowd like smoke. My daughter Maya, a civil rights lawyer who drove back from Atlanta the moment I called, had said the same thing on our porch the night before. Dad, on paper, this road isn't yours. I set the check back on the podium. 4 generations. 1 clerical error from 1952. And I was about to lose it all. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. But in 1955, my father drove iron brackets into the ground along that entire boundary line, 1 post at a time, while I stood beside him holding the bucket. The state will forget this, Silas. The earth won't. Harrison Thorne had digital maps, survey records, and 4 lawyers. He never thought to look 3 feet underground. The peaches were going bad again. Silas Miller could smell them before he even opened his eyes that morning. That heavy, overripe sweetness that had once meant profit, had once meant the particular satisfaction of a man who timed his harvest right, and brought his fruit to market before the August heat had a chance to steal anything from him. Now the smell had curdled into something else entirely. Something closer to loss. The peaches were rotting on the branch because he couldn't afford the crew to pick them. And every morning that smell drifted through the screen door and settled into the kitchen like a quiet accusation. He stood at the counter in his undershirt and work pants, the ceiling fan turning slow overhead, pushing the Georgia heat from one corner of the room to another without much conviction. The digital clock on the microwave read 6:47 a.m. Outside, the light was already white and merciless, the way it gets in late July, when the sky forgets what clouds are for, and the red Georgia clay bakes itself into something closer to ceramic. Silas was 68 years old. He had been waking up in this kitchen since before Kennedy was shot. He picked up the envelope from the stack on the counter, the one with the blue Medicare logo in the upper left corner. The one he had been setting aside for 3 days because he already knew what was inside it, and knowing didn't make opening it any easier. He worked his thumb under the flap, the paper tearing in an uneven line, and unfolded the single sheet inside. Explanation of benefits. That was what they called it. Benefits. As though the $12,000 printed in the balance column was something being done for him. He read the line twice. $12,000 patient responsibility, insulin therapy, continuous care, services rendered March through June. $12,000 for keeping Dorothy alive. He set the statement on the counter and pressed both palms flat against the formica. The way a man does when he needs the earth to hold him up and the earth isn't available. The ceiling fan turned. The peaches rotted. The morning light came through the window at a low angle and caught the dust motes drifting above the kitchen table, where 4 generations of Millers had eaten breakfast, argued, prayed, and occasionally wept into their coffee. Silas's grandfather had built this house in 1931. His father had added the back porch in 1959. Silas himself had replaced the roof in 2001, doing most of the labor himself because the quote from the contractor was something that required a sit down and a glass of water before he could process it. He had replaced it again in 2018, and that time he'd had to take out a small loan, and the loan was still there. A quiet tick in the background of everything, like a clock he'd learned not to hear. He folded the Medicare statement in half, then in half again, and put it in the breast pocket of his work shirt. He did this the way a man does when he has no solution but cannot bring himself to throw the problem away. Through the screen door, the yard was still. His main peach orchard ran south along the sloped quarter-mile to the county road. The trees heavy and untended, their branches hanging low with the weight of all that wasted fruit. To the east, his access road, the gravel path that connected the farm to Route 29. The road his trucks had run for 40 years, the road his father's truck had run before that, cut through a strip of red clay field between two parcels that had always, in the Miller family's understanding of the world, been theirs. That understanding was about to get complicated. He heard the truck before he saw it. A diesel engine, low and patient, and then the white shape of it appeared at his gate, a crew cab pickup with the Thorn Construction logo on the door. A blue and silver emblem that Silas had been seeing on highway signs and road equipment around Liberty County for the better part of 2 years. The truck idled at the edge of his property line, and a man in a hard hat and an orange safety vest climbed out and walked to the back of the vehicle with the unhurried confidence of someone who has been told that what he's doing is perfectly legal. Silas watched through the screen door. The worker pulled a steel survey stake from the truck bed, the kind with the orange plastic flag on top that flaps in the wind, and walked directly onto Silas's access road. He knelt in the gravel, set the pointed end of the stake against the ground, and began driving it in with a rubber mallet. 3 strikes. 4. The sound carried across the yard, each impact clean and deliberate. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Silas's hand found the door handle. He crossed the yard in the heat, his work boots raising small puffs of red dust with each step, his eyes fixed on the orange flag. The worker had stood back up and was noting something on a clipboard. And he turned at the sound of Silas's approach with the expression of a man who had done this before and had his responses ready. "Morning," the worker said. "That's my road," Silas said. The worker, young, mid-30s, the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to be uncomfortable with other people's discomfort, glanced down at his clipboard. "Sir, I'm just placing survey markers per our permit. Thorn Construction has authorization from the county to—" "I heard what I said." Silas stepped forward and crouched beside the stake. He wrapped his fingers around the cold metal, and it was cold, even in the July heat, the way metal holds its own temperature. Separate from the world around it, and he felt the solidity of it. Driven 3 or 4 inches into the gravel that his father had laid down by hand in 1961. "Who gave you permission to put this on my property?" "Sir, the permit was issued by Liberty County based on the current survey of record. I don't set policy, I just place." "Who signed the permit?" The worker hesitated. "I'd have to refer you to our office for that." Silas looked at the stake in his hand. He looked at the orange flag, snapping in a small breeze that had come up from the south, carrying with it the smell of the orchard, all those rotting peaches, all that lost money. He looked at the white truck idling at his gate, its engine patient and indifferent, and he thought about the Medicare statement folded in his breast pocket, pressing against his chest like a second heartbeat. He let go of the stake. He stood up slowly, the way a man does when his knees have been telling him things for a decade that he has been politely ignoring. And he looked at the worker with the particular expression of a man who has decided that anger, right now, is a luxury he cannot afford. "Tell your office," Silas said, "that this road has been in continuous use by the Miller family since 1952. Tell them that before they put another stake in my ground, they are going to want to be very certain of what they're claiming." The worker wrote something on his clipboard. He did not agree or disagree. He got back in the truck. Silas stood in the gravel until the white truck had reversed out and disappeared around the bend toward the county road. And then he stood there a moment longer, alone in the heat, his fingers still feeling the cold of the metal stake. He looked down at his hands. The red clay was already under his fingernails, the way it always was, the way it had been every morning of his working life. The same red clay that was under his father's nails in the photograph on the kitchen wall. The same red clay that his grandfather had turned with a mule and a wood-handled plow before there was a highway within 20 miles of this place. He pressed his thumbnail against the pad of his index finger and felt the clay there, packed into the half-moon of the nail. Fine-grained and rich with the particular mineral heaviness that geologists had told him once came from the iron oxide in the underlying bedrock. The earth under this farm had iron in it. It always had. He just hadn't known yet how much that was going to matter. Maya Miller had not been back to Liberty County in 4 years. She had told herself, during those 4 years, that this was a practical matter rather than an emotional one. Her firm was in Atlanta. Her caseload was in Atlanta. Her apartment, her dry cleaner, her standing Saturday morning run along the Beltline. The coffee shop where they knew her order before she reached the counter, all of it was in Atlanta, 2.5 hours north on I-16. A distance that was perfectly reasonable to maintain when the relationship between a daughter and her father had calcified into something that functioned better across a telephone line than across a kitchen table. She and Silas had not fought about anything specific. That was the particular cruelty of it. They had simply grown into different people who reminded each other, in the proximity of the same room, of every conversation they had not finished. And every apology that had been withheld just long enough to become impossible to offer. She turned her rental car, a silver Camry that smelled of airport and someone else's air freshener, off the county road and onto the gravel access path, and the sound of the tires on the loose stone was so precisely the sound of her childhood that something moved in her chest that she was not prepared for. She gripped the steering wheel and focused on the ruts in the road. She had gotten Silas's call 3 days ago. He had been characteristically brief. Eminent domain notice. They say the road isn't mine. I don't know what to do, Maya. That last sentence, "I don't know what to do," was the sentence that had made her pull up the Delta app before they'd finished talking. Silas Miller had been saying "I'll handle it" for 68 years. Hearing him say something else entirely had been like hearing a load-bearing wall crack. She parked beside the barn and sat for a moment, looking at the farmhouse. It was the same. That was the first thing she noticed, that it was exactly, almost stubbornly, the same as it had always been. As though the house had decided that changing was not something it was willing to do regardless of what happened around it. The white paint was the same shade of weathered cream. The porch swing was in the same position. The screen door had the same tendency to hang slightly open unless you pushed it all the way. Her high-heeled boots, the ones she wore to depositions, to courtrooms, to the kind of client meetings where she needed the extra 2 inches of psychological advantage, sank immediately into the mud beside the car. She looked down at them and made a brief, private calculation about the kind of day she was apparently going to be having. Silas was on the porch with a glass of iced tea and the formal notice in his hand. And he stood when she came across the yard, and for a moment they looked at each other, with the particular careful attention of two people who are trying to assess how much the other has changed and whether that change makes things better or worse. "You drove a long way," he said. "You asked me to come," she said. It wasn't a warm reunion, but it was honest, and with Silas and Maya, honesty had always been the language they defaulted to when affection got too complicated. She took the eminent domain notice from his hand and read it on the porch. Standing, her eyes moving through the legal language with the efficiency of someone who had spent 15 years parsing exactly this kind of document. By the second paragraph, she had the structure of it. By the fourth, she had the problem. She sat down on the porch steps. The notice was from the Liberty County Office of Land Management, acting in conjunction with the Georgia Department of Transportation and Thorne Construction LLC. It claimed that a survey conducted in 1952, the original deed survey for the Miller parcel, contained a clerical omission that left a 12-acre strip, including the primary access road, legally unrecorded as Miller property. Under the doctrine of eminent domain, the state was asserting its right to that strip for the purposes of the Route 29 expansion project, currently under the management of Thorne Construction. The buyout offer attached to the notice was $47,000. For 12 acres and the only road off the farm. They blueprinted the whole project, Silas said. He had come to stand beside her and was looking at the tree line at the edge of the property. "Had a man out here last week putting up a stake right in the middle of the road. Bold as you please." Maya spread the blueprint on the porch railing, holding one edge down against the breeze. The road, his road, the gravel path she had ridden her bicycle on as a girl. The road Silas's peach trucks had run every summer for 4 decades was shown on the blueprint in gray, labeled as Proposed Right-of-Way Acquisition Zone, Phase 2. She had seen eminent domain cases before. She had won several of them, and lost a few. And she knew the legal terrain well enough to read the landscape before her with a professional clarity that was, right now, making her stomach tighten. "Dad," she said, And she kept her voice as level as she could manage. The paperwork is clean. On paper, this road isn't yours. She heard him go still beside her. The 1952 deed, she continued, because once you start a sentence like this, you have to finish it, because leaving it half said is worse than saying it whole. There's an omission. The survey recorded the main parcel, the orchard, the house, the barn, but the access strip, this 12 acres, it was never formally included in the recorded deed. The state is saying the omission means it was never legally transferred to the Miller family. Silas was quiet for a long moment. The breeze moved through the peach trees at the bottom of the slope, and the smell of the overripe fruit came up with it, sweet and wrong. My father built that road, he said. I know. His father used that road. Dad, papers don't grow peaches, Maya. His voice was controlled, but she could hear what was underneath it, the way you can hear a river through ice. That road has had Miller trucks on it since before I was born. My grandfather hauled tobacco on that road. My father hauled peaches. I have hauled peaches on that road for 40 years. The county has never once in 40 years suggested it wasn't mine to use. I know all of that, she said quietly. And legally, that matters. Continuous use and possession matters. But the formal deed record is what the state is citing, and right now, without a counter-filing, their paperwork is stronger than our argument. What does a counter-filing cost? She hesitated. She had already done the math on the drive down, running the numbers in her head the way she did when a client was clearly not going to like what she was about to say. The standard retainer for a property rights challenge of this scope in Liberty County. A local attorney who knows the court, who has the relationships, she paused. They're going to want $15,000 up front. Minimum. The silence that followed had weight to it. Silas turned and walked to the porch railing and put both hands on it, looking out over his land. She could see the set of his shoulders, the way they had gone rigid and then, slowly, settled into something heavier than rigidity. Something closer to the way a structure settles when a support is removed and it is learning to carry the load a different way. My 401k, he said. After I pulled from it for Dorothy's care last year, there's about $9,000 left. She said nothing. I'm $6,000 short, he said. And I don't have anything to borrow against. The farm's already leveraged for the equipment loan. The screen door hung slightly open in the breeze, and somewhere inside the house, a clock ticked, and Maya sat on the porch steps of the house she had grown up in and felt the full weight of the fact that being a lawyer, even a good one, even one who had won cases that mattered, did not mean you could always fix the thing that needed fixing. The afternoon light shifted. The shadows of the peach trees stretched long across the red clay. I'm not going anywhere, she said finally. Silas didn't turn around, but she saw his hands relax slightly on the railing, the knuckles going from white back to the color of skin. I'm not charging you a retainer, she said. I'm staying. We're going to look at the 1952 deed. We're going to look at every document in this house that touches that road. And we're going to figure out what we actually have. I'm not taking charity from my own daughter. It's not charity, she said. It's a contingency arrangement. If we win, the court awards fees. If we lose, she stopped. We're not going to lose. He finally turned to look at her. His eyes were the same dark brown they had always been, steady and evaluating, the eyes of a man who had learned early that the world does not often give you what it owes you. And that the gap between those two things is where character gets built. You came a long way, he said again. But this time it wasn't neutral. This time there was something else in it. You're my father, she said simply. The house felt smaller that night. That was the thing Maya noticed when she brought her bag inside and set it on the bed in her old room, where the same quilt was folded at the foot of the mattress and the same water stain from the 2004 roof leak was still visible in the corner of the ceiling. The house felt like the walls had moved inward, like the structure itself was aware of the pressure being applied from outside and was bracing, leaning in to listen to whatever was going to happen next. She opened her laptop on the kitchen table and started pulling case law on adverse possession and continuous use doctrine in Georgia state courts. And she worked until the clock in the hall read midnight, and when she finally looked up, Silas was still in his chair across the room, the Medicare statement on the table beside him, unfolded. He didn't say anything, neither did she, but the light was on, and they were both in it. Harrison Thorne understood the power of a room. He had built his reputation on it, the ability to walk into a space, any space. A boardroom or a bankruptcy hearing or a county commission meeting in a town that had never heard of him, and to reshape that space by the force of his presence until it oriented around him the way iron filings orient around a magnet. He was 48 years old and had the particular physical confidence of a man who had been told, consistently, since his early 20s, that he was exactly the kind of person a room should pay attention to. He was tall. His suits were custom. His handshake was practiced and firm without being aggressive, and his smile reached his eyes just often enough to seem genuine. The Liberty County Town Hall met on the third Thursday of every month in a low-ceilinged room, with fluorescent lighting and folding metal chairs that had been purchased during the Reagan administration and had the comfort to match. The room held about 200 people when full, and on this particular Thursday, it was full, because Harrison Thorne had spent the preceding 2 weeks making sure it would be. Silas had known about the meeting from the notice board outside the post office. He had told Maya at breakfast. She had said she would come. He had told her not to, that he wanted to speak for himself. She had held his gaze for a long moment and then said she would be in the back of the room and wouldn't open her mouth unless he asked her to. They drove separately. Silas drove his own truck, the way he had driven his truck to every town meeting in Liberty County since 1981. And he parked in the lot behind the building and walked in through the side door, and he saw immediately that something had been arranged here that he had not anticipated. The crowd was not what he expected. He had expected the usual farmers, local businessmen, the county commission members in their good shirts, the local newspaper's lone reporter with his notebook. What he found instead was a crowd that was younger than he was used to, better dressed than he was used to. People who had driven in from somewhere else, and the quality of their attention, the way they leaned forward in their chairs, the way they murmured to each other with the specific energy of people who have already decided something and are here to confirm it, told him that the outcome of this meeting had been decided before anyone had sat down. Thorne was at the front of the room in a charcoal suit, standing beside a presentation screen that showed a gleaming computer rendering of the Route 29 expansion project, a 4-lane divided highway running clean through land that currently had peach trees on it. The rendering showed a modern highway interchange, a service area, a strip of commercial development along the access corridor. It looked like progress. It had been designed to look exactly like progress. Silas took a seat in the back row. Liberty County, Thorne began, and his voice had been trained for exactly this kind of space. It filled the room without effort. Warm and certain, the voice of a man explaining a simple truth, has been waiting for this moment for 20 years. He walked the crowd through the project. 500 permanent jobs. A new school tax revenue projection. Improved emergency response times because of the improved road infrastructure. He spoke with the fluency of someone who had given this speech, or a version of it, in 12 other counties across the Southeast. And he spoke about the future of Georgia's children with the particular conviction of a man who does not have children in Georgia, and therefore can afford to use them freely as rhetorical devices. The crowd responded to all of it. There was applause at the job numbers. There was a swell of approval at the school revenue projection. A woman in the fourth row had brought a hand-lettered sign that read "Thorne Builds Georgia." And she held it up during the applause, and the man beside her took a photograph of it on his phone. And then Thorne turned and looked directly at the back of the room. He looked at Silas the way a man looks at something he has already decided the value of. "Now," Thorne said, "I want to address the elephant in the room." His smile was easy and generous. The smile of a man performing magnanimity for an audience that will reward him for it. We have a neighbor in this county, a good man, I'm sure, a hard-working man who has some concerns about this project. He paused. Silas Miller, "Sir, if you're in this room, I want you to know that we see you." Every head in the room turned toward the back row. Silas did not move. "Mr. Miller's family has farmed a parcel adjacent to the Route 29 corridor for several generations," Thorne continued. "And I have nothing but respect for that legacy. Nothing but respect." He held up both hands, a gesture of openness. "But I have to be honest with this community. When the needs of one individual, one stubborn relic," and here he smiled slightly, the word relic placed with precision, delivered just softly enough to deniable. are holding back the future of our children's schools, of 500 families who need work, of a county that deserves to grow. Then we have to have an honest conversation. From somewhere in the middle rows, Silas heard the word senile spoken at a volume meant to be heard by several people but not formally acknowledged. He heard greedy from somewhere to his left, offered in the same register. He stood up. The room shifted. He walked forward, because he had been to enough town meetings to know that you speak from the front, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds part for someone they are deciding how to regard. And he got to the front of the room and turned to face the assembled people of Liberty County. Some of whom he had known for 50 years, some of whom had never set foot in the county before this evening, and he opened his mouth. "My name is Silas Miller," he said. "My grandfather broke that ground in 1924. My father." The sound of chairs scraping. Someone's phone chirping with a notification. The general ambient noise of a crowd that has decided it is not listening. Thorne moved to the podium and produced an envelope from his inside jacket pocket, and the motion drew every eye in the room, the way a large object entering a space draws attention. And he held the envelope up with the unhurried ease of a man who knows his timing. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice over Silas's S, smooth as oil on water, "Thorne Construction wants to be a good neighbor. We have prepared a fair market compensation offer, $50,000 for the affected parcels, and we're prepared to make that available tonight." He set the envelope on the podium and slid it across the surface. A slow, deliberate motion, the way a man slides a card across a poker table when he's already seen your hand. "We hope you'll consider it." $50,000, presented in front of 200 people, placed on a podium like a gift. As though the number itself offered publicly, offered graciously, was proof that the argument was over. Silas looked at the envelope. He thought about the access road. He thought about his grandfather's hands on a wood-handled plow and the specific weight of the hammer when his father drove the first fence post into that strip of red clay. He thought about the Medicare statement in his breast pocket, $12,000, Dorothy's insulin. The gap between what a man earns in a life and what life eventually costs him. He picked up the envelope. He did not open it. He held it in both hands and looked at it the way a man looks at something that has been offered with contempt dressed as generosity. "Mr. Thorne," he said, and his voice was quiet now, quiet enough that the room had to settle to hear it. "This road has had a Miller on it for 70 years. My father built it by hand. I have maintained it, graded it, put new gravel on it 6 times since 1982. He set the envelope back on the podium. $50,000 isn't a fair offer. It's an insult offered in public to save you the trouble of making a real argument. The room was very still. Thorne smiled. It was a different smile now, still controlled, still practiced, but with something underneath it that a careful observer might have read as the particular irritation of a man who expected to have already won by now. "We're prepared to negotiate within reason, Mr. Miller." "Then get your lawyers ready," Silas said. "Because mine is already here." He didn't look at the back of the room. He didn't need to. He turned and walked back up the aisle toward the door. His boots steady on the linoleum, and the crowd watched him go in the kind of silence that is not emptiness but accumulation, every sound held back, waiting. Outside, in the parking lot, the humidity hit him immediately, and he stood beside his truck and gripped the door handle and pressed his forehead against the warm metal of the truck roof. For just a moment, just long enough to do what needed doing in private. Maya appeared at his shoulder. She said nothing for a moment, just stood there in the parking lot heat while the sound of the meeting continued through the walls of the building behind them. "A man's dignity is a quiet thing," Silas said, "until someone tries to auction it off." "We're going to file a counterclaim first thing Monday morning," she said. "He called me a relic." "I know." Her voice was precise and controlled and had exactly the temperature of a woman who has decided that the emotion she is currently feeling will be substantially more useful when converted into courtroom preparation. "We're going to make him regret that word in front of a judge." Silas got into the truck. The seat was warm from the day's heat. He put the key in the ignition and sat with his hands on the wheel, looking at the windshield. Through the building's side windows, he could see the silhouette of Thorne at the podium, still talking, still shaping the room. Still so certain. Silas started the truck. He couldn't sleep. That was the first thing, the simple, grinding fact of lying in the dark at 1 in the morning. With the ceiling fan turning overhead and his body convinced that sleep was a thing that happened to other people. People whose land wasn't being taken. People whose wives weren't on $12,000 worth of insulin treatments. People whose names weren't being spoken in county meeting rooms as shorthand for obstruction. Dorothy was asleep in the bedroom. Her breathing was slow and measured, the particular rhythm of someone whose body had been through enough that it had learned to rest deeply. Whenever the opportunity presented itself, and he lay beside her for 40 minutes. Listening to that breathing and feeling the specific loneliness of a man who is wide awake beside someone he loves. He didn't want to wake her. She had enough to carry without his 3 o'clock weight added to it. He got up at 2 and went to the barn. The barn was different at night. In the day it was functional tools on their hooks, the riding mower in its corner. The shelving units his father had built from scrap lumber in 1964, still level, still sound. At night the barn was something else, quieter and older, the smells of oil and old wood and the sweet rotting hay bales stacked in the loft. Taking on a different quality in the dark, something closer to memory than to utility. He sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket and turned on the single work light, a bare bulb on an extension cord. The kind of light that illuminates only what it's directly aimed at and leaves everything else in deep shadow, and he held the envelope in his hands. Not Thorne's envelope. He had left that on the podium. This one was from the county sheriff's office. It had arrived that afternoon by certified mail, which meant someone had specifically chosen to make him sign for it, to stand at his own mailbox. And put his name on the receipt as confirmation that yes, he had received the thing that was going to hurt him. Notice of eviction proceedings. Liberty County Superior Court. Case number in the upper right corner. His name in the to field, the way his name appeared on legal documents, Silas James Miller. As though the middle name made it more official, more irreversible. The notice cited the pending resolution of the boundary dispute as grounds for immediate restriction of access to the contested parcel. Pending final court determination, he was to cease use of the access road. Cease use, which meant that until this was resolved in court, he had no legal road off his own land. He set the notice on the workbench beside him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened the cabinet on the wall beside the workbench, the one where he kept his medication, out of Dorothy's sight because she worried when she saw the bottles. And he hadn't told her about the blood pressure situation because she was managing her own situation and did not need his added to it. He took out the weekly pill organizer, the plastic kind with the days of the week printed on each compartment in faded letters. And he turned it in the light and counted. Thursday, Friday, Saturday. The 3 compartments were still full. He had been skipping his blood pressure medication for 3 weeks. The prescription was $87 a month without insurance coverage, which was a number that had made sense to manage when it was just $87. But had become impossible to justify when the Medicare balance was $12,000. And the equipment loan payment was due and the peaches were rotting on the branch because there was no money to hire a harvest crew. He had told himself it was temporary. He had told himself he would refill the prescription when things leveled off. Things had not leveled off. He put the pill organizer back in the cabinet and closed the door. On the workbench, beside the eviction notice, there was a framed photograph. He didn't remember putting it there. It had migrated, the way objects migrate in old houses, from surface to surface across the years, but there it was. And the work light caught it directly. His father, Walter Miller, in 1952. Standing in full summer Georgia heat in his work clothes, one hand resting on a wooden fence post at the corner of the access road, squinting into the sun with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who has just finished a job correctly. Silas stared at that photograph for a long time. The fence post his father was leaning on in the photograph, the corner post of the original boundary fence. The post that marked the edge of the Miller parcel where it met the disputed strip. That post was not visible anywhere on the property now. The county road crew had graded through there in 1987, and whatever was above ground had been removed or rotted away in the decades since. But he leaned closer to the photograph. His father's hand on the post. The post itself not wood, or not just wood. There was something metal on it. He could see it in the photograph, even in the old black and white resolution. Brackets of some kind. Iron brackets. Securing the post to a footing, the way his father had done things, with the particular thoroughness of a man who expects his work to be there after he's gone. Maybe I am just a ghost haunting a land that's already moved on. The thought came in fully formed, the way the worst thoughts do, arriving not as a question but as a statement, presenting itself as fact. He let it sit for a moment. He had never been a man who ran from the things that frightened him. He had learned early that the things you don't look at get larger in the dark. And it was better to face them in the light, even the inadequate single bulb light of a barn at 2 in the morning. He thought about Thorne in the town hall, sliding that envelope across the podium. He thought about the survey stake in his access road, that steel point driven into his father's gravel. He thought about Maya at the kitchen table until midnight, the blue light of her laptop on her face, pulling case law she was not charging him for. He thought about Dorothy's breathing in the bedroom, slow and steady, the breathing of someone who did not know how close the edges were getting. He reached for the post hole digger leaning against the barn wall. The handle was hickory, worn smooth in the grip by 40 years of use, the wood itself warm and familiar in his palm. He didn't know yet exactly what he was thinking. He knew only that he was holding a tool and looking at a photograph, and that somewhere between those two things, there was an answer to a question he hadn't fully formed yet. The iron brackets in the photograph. The corner post. The 1952 boundary. His father had built that fence before the survey error. The fence predated the clerical omission. If the fence still existed, if even the trace of the fence still existed, buried under 70 years of red clay and tractor-turned soil. He set the post hole digger down slowly. He sat back on the overturned bucket in the work light, in the dark of the barn at 2 in the morning. And he turned the idea over carefully, the way you turn a piece of metal to check for flaws before you trust it with weight. If the original boundary fence could be located, if the iron brackets, the corner posts, the physical evidence of the fence his father had built before any survey error had occurred, if that evidence was still there, still underground, still datable to the 1950s. It wouldn't just be testimony. It wouldn't just be a family's word against a billionaire's survey. It would be physical evidence. The kind that a court could hold in its hands. He looked at the photograph. His father looked back from 1952, squinting into the Georgia sun, one hand on a post that Harrison Thorne's project depended on not existing. The darkness of the barn was thick and warm around him. Outside, the peach trees were invisible in the night, but he could smell them, that overripe sweetness, that persistent smell of things that needed to be tended. And it had always smelled like failure to him these past months, like loss. Tonight, sitting alone in the barn with the post hole digger leaning against the wall and a 70-year-old photograph in his hands, it smelled like something else. He wasn't sure yet what to call it, but it felt less like morning and more like the moment before something begins. He sat with it for a long time, until the sky outside. The barn door had begun to go from black to the particular dark blue that means the night is nearly finished. Then he put the photograph in his shirt pocket, beside the eviction notice, and got up. He had a phone call to make in the morning. Friends, what a story we're inside right now. Silas Miller, 68 years old, a man whose family has worked this Georgia clay for 4 generations, is watching everything he's built being threatened by a billionaire and a clerical error from 1952. He's behind on his own blood pressure medication. He's facing an eviction notice. The county meeting that was supposed to give him a chance to speak turned into a public humiliation, with his character dismissed in front of 200 people. And yet, in a dark barn at 2 in the morning, holding a photograph of his father from 1952, something shifted in Silas Miller. Not hope exactly, something quieter and more durable than hope. The iron brackets in that old photograph. The fence post. The idea that the truth might not be gone, just buried. His daughter came back, and together, they're about to dig. Stay with us. The second half of this story is where the red clay starts to talk. 1955. The summer he turned 8, Silas had learned what iron smelled like. It was a particular smell, metallic and clean, with an edge of something almost bitter, the way the air smells just before lightning. His father had been working the fence line on the east side of the access road for 3 days, the iron brackets. Arriving in the back of a neighbor's truck in wooden crates packed with straw, each bracket stamped with a manufacturer's mark that Silas could feel under his fingertips but couldn't read. "Hold this," his father had said, and Silas had held the bucket, a galvanized pail full of iron nails and corner brackets, while Walter Miller worked methodically down the line, driving the brackets into the post footings with a hammer whose weight required both of his father's hands when the angle was difficult. The sound of that hammer, clean and certain, one blow after another, each strike landing with the particular resonance of metal on metal and then earth receiving metal, the fence growing behind them as they moved along the line, one post at a time, one bracket at a time, the boundary between the Miller land and everything else being established in iron because his father believed in establishing things in iron. The state forgot to record this, Silas, but the earth won't. He had not understood that sentence when he was 8. He had understood the hammer, and the smell of the metal, and the way his father's forearms looked when he worked the tendons moving under the skin, the sweat darkening his shirt, and the specific, uncomplicated sense of being useful that comes from holding a bucket correctly, while a man you trust does important work. He had not understood the sentence until he was sitting in a barn 63 years later holding an eviction notice and a photograph. He came back to the present by degrees, the way you surface from water. And the barn was warm and the photograph was in his hands, and outside the sky had gone that particular pre-dawn blue that means the night is nearly done. He remembered the time capsule. That was what his father had called it, not a formal time capsule with a box and a ceremony, but a handful of iron nails wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and placed under the corner post with the specific pragmatism of a man who expected someone to need proof eventually and wanted to leave them the means to find it. "The earth won't forget," his father had said. Silas put the photograph in his shirt pocket and went inside to make coffee and wait for a reasonable hour to call Marcus Reed. Marcus had been his closest friend since the 4th grade, a connection that had survived Silas's marriage, and Marcus's career as a geologist with the USGS, and Marcus's retirement to a farm outside Waynesboro, and 4 decades of the ordinary drift that occurs between men who care about each other but are busy with their lives. They spoke on the phone 3 or 4 times a year. They had last seen each other at a funeral in February. At 6:15, Silas called. Marcus answered on the second ring, which meant he was already up, which was the thing about men of a certain age. The body stops negotiating with you about sleep and starts simply delivering you to the morning whether you've requested it or not. "Silas, I need a geologist," Silas said. A pause. "What kind of trouble?" "The buried kind." He told Marcus everything. He was concise about it. He didn't have the energy for anything but the essential facts, and Marcus listened without interruption. The way a man listens when he understands that what he's hearing matters and that his role right now is to receive it accurately. When Silas finished, the line was quiet for a moment. "Iron brackets," Marcus said. "Under 70 years of Georgia red clay. My father buried them at the corner posts. The whole fence line. I watched him do it in 1955. 70 years in that soil." Marcus paused, and Silas could hear the geologist in him engaging with the problem. The way a mechanic engages with a diagnosis, moving from symptom to structure to solution. "Iron doesn't disappear, Silas. It oxidizes. It stains the surrounding matrix. If the brackets went in during the mid-1950s, I can date the sediment layer. The silt stratification in that area should show a clear 1950s deposit line. If the iron's there, I can put it in a geological context that a court won't be able to argue with." "Can you come?" "When?" "Soon," Silas said, "before they move on the road." "I'll drive down Thursday," Marcus said. "And Silas." A brief pause. "Bring a good drill." Silas hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen with his coffee going cold in his hand, looking out through the screen door at the access road in the early morning light. The survey stake was still there, its orange flag hanging still in the humid air. The past isn't a memory. It's a foundation waiting to be uncovered. He picked up his coffee and drank it, and for the first time in weeks, it tasted like something. The storm came in from the Gulf on a Thursday evening, the way Gulf storms come, not gradually but decisively, the sky going from white heat to green-gray in the span of an hour. The wind arriving ahead of the rain with that particular charged smell that makes livestock restless and old farmers attentive. Marcus Reed had arrived that afternoon in a pickup truck loaded with equipment that Silas did not immediately recognize, but that Marcus handled with the ease of long familiarity: soil core sampling tubes of various diameters, a portable drill rig that assembled from components Marcus could carry himself, sealed collection containers, a field magnetometer that looked like something from a decade Silas couldn't quite place. Marcus was 70 years old and moved like a man of 55, which Silas attributed partly to genetics, and partly to the fact that Marcus had spent his career outdoors and had never entirely allowed retirement to convince him that sitting was the natural state of the human body. His hair was white and cropped close, and he had the particular calm of someone who has spent decades making precise observations about the physical world, and has found that precision, reliably, is more useful than urgency. "Show me the line," Marcus said, before he'd even had a glass of water. Silas walked him out to the access road and walked him south along the disputed strip, and he talked as they walked: the photograph, the 1952 survey, the iron brackets his father had used, the corner posts, the specific locations he remembered from 1955. With the clarity of childhood memory preserved by the fact that the memory had not been examined much until it suddenly became essential. Marcus listened and looked at the ground with a geologist's attention, which is different from the attention of someone who sees surfaces. A geologist looks at what the surface is resting on, and what that thing is resting on, and what pressures and depositions and time have produced the particular configuration of earth he is standing in front of. He knelt twice to pick up small handfuls of soil, working them between his fingers, smelling them once with an expression of professional concentration. "The stratification here should be clear," he said. 70 years of undisturbed silt over whatever was put down in the early 50s. Wheel core along the disputed boundary line. If the iron is there, the magnetometer will find it before we drill. The storm hit at 7:15, the rain arriving with the abruptness of a curtain. Dropped, and Silas stood on the access road in the downpour and looked at Marcus, and Marcus looked back at him with an expression that asked a question without words. "We work," Silas said. They worked under the cover of the storm, which provided its own particular kind of concealment, not intentional, but practical. The sound of the rain covered the sound of the drill. The gray curtain of the downpour made the activity at the fence line invisible from the road. They wore rain gear and headlamps and they moved down the boundary line in a steady, methodical progression. Marcus operating the magnetometer first, its readings feeding to a small handheld display, and Silas holding the sampling tubes and watching the display with a focused attention that surprised him, given that he had never looked at a geological instrument in his life. "Here," Marcus said, at the third point along the line. The magnetometer reading spiked. Not dramatically, it was a precise instrument and its responses were precise, but the increase was clear and consistent. A column of ferrous material running vertically downward from roughly 18 inches below the surface. And here, at the fifth point, and again at the eighth, the readings were consistent with the regular spacing of fence posts. 12 feet between each spike. Exactly the spacing Silas remembered his father using. Maya had followed them out when the storm started, initially to tell them they were being unreasonable, and had stayed when she saw the magnetometer readings. She was standing now at the back of Marcus's truck with her laptop open under the truck's camper shell, connected to the portable soil analysis software Marcus had brought, watching the data populate in real time as Marcus logged each reading. The drill came out for the third spike, the one that read strongest on the magnetometer, and Marcus worked it into the soil with practiced efficiency. The core tube going down 18 inches, 20, 24, the earth giving it up layer by layer as the tube descended. When he withdrew it, he held the transparent core tube up to Silas's headlamp, and they looked at the column of earth inside it together, the layers visible in cross-section, each stratum its own color, its own texture, its own age. At approximately 3.5 feet depth, the core changed. The red clay shifted to a grayer, denser silt, a deposit layer from a different decade. And embedded in that layer, at exactly the depth where a post footing would have been set in 1952, was the dark stain of oxidized iron, and within the stain, partially dissolved but structurally intact, the corroded shape of an iron bracket. Silas looked at it for a long time. The rain came down around them. The headlamps made small circles of light in the dark. Somewhere down the road, the orange survey stake flapped its flag in the storm wind. Maya's voice came from the truck. Marcus, I need you to look at this analysis output. The silt layer. Can you give me a date range we can defend in court? Marcus carried the core tube to the truck and bent over the laptop screen. Reading the field analysis numbers, and his expression did what expert faces do when the data confirms what the expert has already suspected. It settled into a particular quietness, the quietness of certainty. Mid-1950s to early 1960s deposition, he said. The layer is consistent. The iron signature is consistent. The depth is consistent with a post-footing set during that period. He looked at Silas. I can write an affidavit stating to a reasonable degree of geological certainty that this iron material was placed in the ground between 1950 and 1960 along this exact boundary line. Maya was already typing. Silas stood in the rain at the back of the truck and looked at the core tube in Marcus's hand, the small column of Georgia earth, the 70-year-old iron stain. The physical record of a boundary his father had established with a hammer and a bucket of brackets on a summer afternoon in 1955. While an 8-year-old boy held the bucket and listened to the sound of the hammer. He wiped the rain from his face. His jaw was set. The iron his father had put in the ground had not gone anywhere. It had just been waiting. Liberty County Superior Court had the particular quality of old civic buildings in the south, marble floors that held the cool of the morning well into the afternoon. Wood paneling that had darkened over decades to the color of strong tea. The smell of paper and institutional cleaner and the accumulated gravity of decisions made in this room over generations. The ceiling was high. The windows were tall and narrow and let in light in vertical columns that moved slowly across the floor as the morning progressed. Judge Caroline Hartley had been on the Liberty County bench for 19 years. She was 61 years old, originally from Savannah, and she had the particular judicial temperament that comes from 2 decades of watching people bring their worst problems into her courtroom. And expecting her to resolve them fairly, a temperament characterized by patience with process, impatience with theater, and the calm, practiced authority of someone who has long since stopped being impressed by expensive suits. Thorne's legal team was 4 attorneys. They had a custom-built display system, a large monitor on a rolling stand, connected to a laptop operated by a young associate who had the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this in 17 other counties. They had a digital reconstruction of the 1952 Liberty County Land Survey, enhanced and annotated, rendered in the precise, authoritative visual language of professional cartography. It looked indisputable. It had been designed to look indisputable. Lead counsel was a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been in private practice for 30 years. And who had represented infrastructure developers in eminent domain cases across Georgia and the Carolinas. He was experienced. He was methodical. He began his presentation with the 1952 deed, moved through the clerical omission with careful precision, cited 3 controlling cases in Georgia property law, and presented the enhanced digital survey as the final piece of a clean, closed argument. He was very good at his job. He finished to the silence of a courtroom that had been watching an expert performance and knew it. Then Maya stood up. She was 39 years old and 5'4" in the low-heeled shoes she had worn specifically because she did not need the extra 2 inches today. She had spent 23 hours over the preceding 4 days preparing for this morning. And she had the particular contained energy of a person who has worked so long toward a specific moment that the arrival of the moment has a slightly surreal quality. The world finally catching up to what has existed in her preparation for days. Your Honor, she said, the state has presented a compelling piece of paper. What the state has not presented is what the land itself has to say about the matter. She paused. We'd like to do that now. She nodded to Silas. He was sitting at the counsel table in his good shirt, the blue one. The one Dorothy had ironed for him the night before with the particular careful attention she gave to things she believed mattered, and he stood and lifted the object he had brought from the floor beside his chair. It was a 4-foot section of transparent plastic core tube, sealed at both ends, filled with a column of Georgia red clay. The layers were visible through the plastic, the color gradations, the textural shifts from one decade to another. And at approximately the 3.5-foot depth mark, clear to anyone in the room who looked at it, the dark Unmistakable stain of oxidized iron encasing the corroded but structurally recognizable shape of an iron bracket. He set it on the evidence table with a sound that carried in the marble room. Clean and solid. A sound like something landing that had been on its way for a long time. Gerald Fitch looked at the tube. His expression did not change, but the young associate with the laptop looked at it and then looked at Fitch and then looked back at his laptop. With the expression of someone urgently reconsidering their morning. Marcus Reed testified for 40 minutes. He had been doing expert testimony since 1989 and he gave it the way a man gives a thing he has done many times and has never become careless about, precisely, clearly, without embellishment. Responding to Fitch's cross-examination with the calm of someone whose conclusions are not opinions but measurements. The iron material in the core sample was consistent with mid-1950s manufacture. The sediment layer in which it was found showed geological characteristics consistent with undisturbed deposition between 1950 and 1962. The spatial distribution of the iron signatures along the disputed boundary line, he had brought a map, hand-drawn with careful notation, was consistent with regularly spaced fence post footings at 12-foot intervals. The physical evidence demonstrated, to a reasonable degree of geological certainty, that a fence had been installed along this boundary line during the period 1950 to 1960. Before the survey error, before the deed omission, before any of Thorne's paperwork existed. When it was Maya's turn to close, she stood before Judge Hartley and spoke without notes. The state's claim rests entirely on a clerical omission in a 1952 deed survey, she said. An omission that occurred in an office, at a desk, in a filing error, not in the ground. The Miller family did not omit anything from the ground. The Miller family built a fence. Silas Miller's father drove iron brackets into the soil of this boundary line in 1955. And the iron is still there, and it has been there continuously for 70 years, through every deed recorded and every survey conducted and every legal document filed in this county. She stopped. Today, the earth wrote in ink what my father's heart has been shouting in silence since the day that survey stake went into his road. We asked the court to read it. She sat down. The room was quiet. Judge Hartley studied the core tube on the evidence table for a long moment. She read through Marcus's affidavit. She looked at the spatial distribution map. She made a note on her legal pad. Gerald Fitch made a final argument about the primacy of recorded deed documentation in property law. He was professional and thorough and he cited his cases correctly. He was also, visibly, working from a position that had been substantially complicated by a 4-foot tube of red clay. The judge's ruling took 11 minutes to deliver. The physical evidence of continuous possession and use, combined with the geological evidence of the original boundary establishment predating the survey error, was sufficient under Georgia adverse possession doctrine to establish the Miller family's legal claim to the disputed 12 acres. The clerical omission of 1952 could not supersede 70 years of documented physical presence. The survey stake was to be removed within 48 hours. The eminent domain notice was vacated. The Route 29 expansion project, as currently designed, was halted pending a redesign that did not require the Miller access corridor. Thorne was in the back of the courtroom. Maya saw him stand and lean toward Gerald Fitch with the controlled fury of a man who has expected to win and has encountered, perhaps for the first time in some years, the experience of the world declining to arrange itself according to his expectations. Silas was sitting at the counsel table with his hands flat on the surface, looking at the core tube. Maya sat down beside him. She didn't say anything for a moment. The courtroom was filling with sound again, chairs moving, voices, the ambient noise of people resuming their normal relationship to the world. "Dad," she said quietly. He turned to look at her. His eyes were steady and dark and had the particular quality of a man who has been afraid for a long time and has just, in this moment, been relieved of it. "The dirt on my hands," he said slowly, "that was the cleanest thing in this courtroom today." She looked at his hands. They were clean, he had scrubbed them for court. But she understood what he meant, and she put her hand over his on the table, and left it there. The survey stake was gone by Friday morning. Silas had gotten up early not because of insomnia this time, but from the straightforward habit of a farmer's body that knows what time the light arrives and sees no reason to waste it. And he had walked down the access road in the cool of the early morning and found the road exactly as it should have been. The gravel undisturbed, the orange flag absent, the small hole where the stake had been tamped down already filling in with the loose stone of the road surface, the way the road was quietly reclaiming the space that had been interrupted. He stood in the road for a while, in the morning quiet, listening to the birds in the orchard. The peaches were gone, the season was too far lost to recover, but the trees themselves were fine. They were healthy trees. They had been tended by 3 generations of Millers, and they knew how to carry a season that had gone badly. They would flower again in the spring. He would have a harvest crew next year, hired and paid in advance. Because the conservation easement he was signing with the Georgia Agricultural Land Trust included a 3-year operating grant for working farms with documented historical tenure. Maya had arranged it. She had, in the weeks since the court ruling, moved with the specific efficiency of a person who has been storing up confidence for a fight that is now over, and who transfers that energy immediately and completely to the next necessary thing. She had filed the easement paperwork, contacted the land trust, negotiated the grant terms, and presented the final document to Silas with the straightforward manner she had always used when she believed something was correct, and did not want to spend time being argued with about it. He had not argued. She was on the porch when he came back from the road, sitting in the porch swing with a coffee mug in both hands, her bare feet pulled up beneath her. She was not wearing the high-heeled boots. She was wearing an old pair of canvas sneakers she had found in the hall closet, the kind that had been there so long they had become part of the house. And this struck Silas as significant in a way he could not quite quantify, but that he felt the weight of, the way you feel the weight of small, real things. "Road's clear," he said. "I know," she said. "I watched them remove it from the porch yesterday morning." He sat down beside her in the swing. The chain gave its familiar creak. The swing began to move, the slow back and forth that had been the rhythm of his evenings here for 40 years. "I talked to the land trust attorney again last night," Maya said. "Once the easement is recorded, no developer can touch this property. Not Thorne, not anyone after Thorne, not the county without a process that will take years and will be public and documented from the start." She looked at her coffee. "The iron brackets will be part of the easement filing. Geological exhibit, formally entered. Your father's fence line is now part of the legal record of this property in perpetuity." Silas thought about that. He thought about his father in 1952 with a hammer and a bucket of iron brackets, driving the boundary into the earth with the practical thoroughness of a man who expected his work to last. He thought about 8-year-old Silas holding the bucket, listening to the sound of the hammer. "He said the earth wouldn't forget," Silas said. He was right. Dorothy came to the screen door and looked out at them, and she had the expression she sometimes had in the morning, when she was not quite awake enough to have assembled her careful stoicism about how things were going, the expression that was just her actual feeling, unguarded and plain. She looked at Silas in the swing, and at Maya beside him, and something in her face settled into a quiet that was not sadness but its resolution. "There's biscuits," she said. "Be right in," Silas said. She went back inside. Through the screen, he could hear her moving in the kitchen. The particular sounds of a woman who has been making biscuits in the same kitchen for 40 years and whose body does it without requiring her full attention. He looked out over the land. The morning light was coming in low across the orchard, the way it came in August, and it hit the red clay of the access road and turned it briefly the color of copper. Bright and warm, and he could see in the light the way the road ran south toward Route 29, uninterrupted, as it had always run, as it would run. Maya was beside him in the swing, quiet, looking at the same thing he was looking at. "I'm going to need help with the fall maintenance," he said. "The road needs regrading. The equipment loan's in better shape now, but the tractor needs a part I've been putting off." "I have a firm," she said. "I know you have a firm. I have cases in Atlanta." "I know." A pause. "I'm going to be down more often," she said. Not as a concession, as a statement of something she had already decided. "The drive is 2.5 hours. I've driven farther for worse reasons." He did not say anything for a moment. He let the swing move. "Your mother makes good biscuits," he said. "I know," Maya said. "I've been away too long." He reached over and put his hand briefly on her shoulder, not a long gesture. Not a ceremonial one, just the quick, weighted touch of a father who is not practiced at the language of tenderness but who understands that there are moments when the thing must be said in some language or it will go unsaid. She leaned into it slightly, just for a second, and then the swing moved and the moment passed into the ordinary morning. Later, after breakfast, when Dorothy had gone to rest and the day's first real heat was settling in, Silas stood at the kitchen table with the land trust easement document and a pen. His name was in the signature field in printed letters, Silas James Miller, and below it, the line where he was to sign. He had signed a lot of documents in recent months. Medicare forms and loan acknowledgments and the certified mail receipt for the eviction notice and the counterfiling at the county courthouse. His name put to paper over and over in contexts that had felt, each time, like he was signing away pieces of something rather than securing them. He picked up the pen. He signed his name, his full name, all three parts of it, and the pen moved with a steadiness that surprised him, or would have surprised him a few months ago. Before the barn at 2 in the morning and the core tubes in the thunderstorm and the marble courtroom, where Georgia red clay had proven itself more durable than a billionaire's survey. He set the pen down and looked at his signature on the document. Silas James Miller. It looked like his. It felt like his. For the first time in a long time, for the first time in perhaps years, when he looked at his own name on a piece of paper, it did not feel like a notation of what he owed or what he stood to lose. It felt like a deed. It felt like the name of a man who owns something and has proven it and has written it into the record of the earth itself. He put the cap on the pen. He put the easement in the envelope Maya had addressed. He walked it out to the mailbox and put the flag up. The red clay of the access road was warm under his boots. The peach trees stood in their rows in the August light, heavy with the weight of a year that had nearly taken everything and had not. Somewhere in the soil beneath his feet, at 3.5 feet depth in a layer of mid-century Georgia silt, iron brackets that his father had driven into the ground with a hammer and a belief in permanence were still exactly where they had always been. The red clay didn't just grow peaches this year. It grew a future. Friends, how did you find today's story? Silas Miller, 68 years old, a man who woke up every morning to the smell of rotting peaches and a Medicare bill he couldn't pay. Who stood in a town hall meeting and was called a relic in front of his own neighbors, who sat alone in a barn at 2 in the morning wondering if the land had already moved on without him. And yet, what this story gave us today is something I think about every time we share these journeys with you. It wasn't just a legal victory. It wasn't just an old farmer beating a powerful man in court. It was something quieter and more important than that. It was a man who discovered that the evidence he needed had been there the whole time. Waiting in the earth, placed there by a father who believed that the truth is worth burying in iron, because iron lasts. That's the lesson that stays with me. We all have iron in the ground somewhere. The work our parents did. The values they installed in us before we were old enough to understand what we were receiving. The foundations we can't see because they're below the surface, below the noise and the debt. And the fear and the people who want to tell us our land was never really ours. You don't always have to fight louder than the opposition. Sometimes you just have to be willing to dig. Silas went to his barn at 2 in the morning not with a lawyer's brief but with a photograph. And from that photograph came a memory, and from the memory came a question, and from the question came a thunderstorm and a drill rig and a man named Marcus who had been his friend since the 4th grade. Truth doesn't always arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it arrives in a bucket of iron brackets and a childhood memory that you've been carrying so long you forgot it was evidence. I hope this story brought you something today. I hope it reminded you that what's been invested in you by the people who came before you, by the ones who shaped the ground you stand on doesn't disappear just because someone with a survey map says it isn't there. The earth remembers. You can count on that. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe and hit that like button and leave us a comment below. Tell us what you're carrying. Tell us what's buried in your ground. We read every word.